Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. We're going to have a conversation about the creative process. And when I was talking with Steve and Kyna and Peter prior to our conversation now, I said that talking about design process and creative process is, I think, like talking about religion. Everybody has a point of view. So I hope that that will actually make for a very lively discussion. We are talking about design and creative process primarily because of the three books that are in front of me. One of Steve's most recent books is The Graphic Design Idea Book, as he's written over 170, and this counting. Peter Ahlberg just wrote an extraordinary book, Please Make This Look Nice. And Kyna Leski is a professor of architecture at RISD, and as well a founding principal of 360 Architecture, and she's an artist and an actor, and the author of The Storm of Creativity. So we're going to talk about the process of design and creativity using their books as a bit of a jumping point for me, and then in about a half hour, we're going to open up the floor to questions. So you get to ask Steve and Kyna and Peter questions of your own. So I'm going to start with a question for Peter. Peter, in the foreword to your book, Brett Littman states, in the case of graphic design, I would guess that many people aren't even aware that there is a process. They think that Helvetica just appears on their computer and don't understand that the letter forms were actually created by someone or many people, as the case may be. And he speaks quite definitively, and I was ready to sort of just move on to the next sentence in the foreword, and then all of a sudden I thought, wait a second, I'm not sure I agree with that. Yeah. We're living in a day and age now where 50,000 people, non-designers presumably, signed a change.org petition to try to persuade a college in California to cancel a rebranding of the school. So my first question for the panelists, for all the panelists, is do you agree that most people aren't aware that design is a process created by actual people or not? Thunderous silence.
We're looking at you, Peter.
Okay. This thing on. I think that, I mean, using Brett's, what Brett said as a jumping off point, I think that there's certainly a greater awareness with design in all practices, in all capacities, whether it's graphic or otherwise. But I think that, speaking specifically to graphic design, the nature of it is that it's so ubiquitous, and that I gave a talk recently about the book where I described it as air. It's like to talk about design is like saying, there it is. It's everywhere, and it's so layered from the biggest signage programs on a building all the way down to labels at the supermarket, and then there's typography, which is a whole other layer which is embedded within design. And so I think that in general there's a much greater awareness of design in general, but I still think that there's a disconnect between understanding what goes into it and understanding the layers of what the it is.
Kyna, Steve, what about you?
Well, I think I'm coming from the architecture world, and the problem that I find in architecture is that very often clients expect that the only time you spend in creating a project is this time spent on the drawing, not the whole process that is designing through many drawings, the drawing that they have. And so I certainly encounter that kind of, obliviousness. But in part, I think we're to blame, because when a great jazz musician says, oh, it's just a little thing that I whipped up, or when we use the word genius to describe the process, because it's very difficult to talk about. I mean, this is probably in part what motivates me, and because I do teach it, that by dismissing it, we're not recognizing the real intelligences that are involved in design: spatial cognition, the intelligence of the hand, material imagination, and we can go on and on and on, that are real intelligences that may not appear on the SATs, but they're part of what you do and what you develop. And so I take that on as part of our responsibility. That's being said, does anyone know who designed the paperclip? You know, I mean, if we're talking about air, you know, how present it is.
I know the book that tells you who designed it.
Oh, really? Well, that's better than me.
Antonelli's book,
but,
right?
you know, so.
No, Wabashinsky.
So even from, you know, that's another kind of responsibility that I certainly should, you know, take on better than I have, to be more aware of these many examples that are around us everywhere.
Yeah, I think the majority of the people in our country, at any rate, know what graphic design is now because they see it on their computer. And I like to make grand generalizations based on small anecdotes. And I was in a class of students, 85 students in a graphic design class, undergraduate, first or second year, and I asked, how many of you want to be graphic designers? And maybe a third raised their hand, and the other third said, we're here because our parents wanted us to be here, so that we could earn a living. So I think people know what graphic design is. They don't know the nuance of graphic design. They don't know what's good, what's bad, what's mediocre. They know a logo is a graphic design result. They now know a typeface probably belongs to somebody who made it or a team that made it. But I think consciousness has levels, and the general understanding, the general literacy is probably better now than it was 30 years ago, and maybe even 20 years ago.
Peter, in your book, Michael Beirut states, most designers are required to talk about the process because we have agreements with our clients. Typically, part of that agreement is describing in advance the steps that we'll take to get them from nothing to whatever it is that they want. Those steps are predictable and they follow a sequence. The challenge is that so often the actual work doesn't have anything to do with the way the process is described. And then in further interviews, Peter has with Natasha Jen, Myra Kelman, Elliot Earls, and Stephen Doyle, Natasha Jen states that design is always clueless. Milton Glaser says it's very random. Myra Kelman says it's a sense of order and a sense of freedom. Elliot Earls quotes Jack Kerouac and says, first idea, best idea. And then Stephen Doyle states, it never occurred to me that idea and form are two different areas. Yet, all three of you have written really marvelous books about ideas and process. So is process important, and why, if it is it?
You want me to start with that?
Why don't you start with that, yes. And then we can have a conversation about it, because I do feel that process is clearly something we're all intrigued by, that everybody has a point of view, and therefore if everybody has a point of view and it is a different point of view, it is a really important discussion. But I've yet to, and Kyna, maybe you can help us here, because you in many ways have codified a process, but I think it's worthy of a discussion.
I think that in terms of the worthiness, right, that's where we'll start. I think that in terms of the worthiness of process and talking about it, I think that it's, as we were talking about earlier, I think that there's oftentimes a huge gap, especially in graphic design, between, well, maybe in any practice, between how it's talked about almost in hindsight and how it's actually done. Sort of building off of what a lot of those other people said, and I know, Stephen, this is also something you talk about, there's always spontaneity, unconsciousness. There are all sorts of prerequisites that go into the process of a project that oftentimes we aren't even aware of. And so I think that what talking about the process does is, even if it's very hard to define, I think it raises the awareness of what goes into it. And pulling from sort of, if you were to distill all the interviews from my book, I think that at the end of the day, the creative process in any enterprise is incredibly personal. And that, I think, is the value in talking about it, because from an educator standpoint, I encounter students year in and year out who feel like there are right and wrong ways of making design.
And do you agree? Do you think that there are right and wrong ways?
No, I don't.
But there are good and bad ways.
But how do you know what the difference is?
Yeah.
You know the difference when you see it, which means the process is intuitive. But you can't teach intuition, so you teach something that's structured.
Is the assessment intuitive or the process?
I think you can teach intuition.
You do?
Yes,
How?
So if you want to have a...
Yes.
Well, I'm really anti-methodology. Like, it's something that's the premise of my teaching is not, but I think that whether you're a scientist, whether you're a poet, whether you're an actor, a writer, an artist, an architect, that it's about a discovery that comes from when you realize something that you thought you knew is not the case. And then you're stuck in this state of, it's usually a very uncomfortable state, because suddenly you're uncertain about things that you thought you were certain about. And these can be in tiny, tiny ways.
Can you give us some examples or give us some sense of why you feel that way?
Well, what I was going to say, let me just finish.
Sure.
So the impulse that comes, which is not the impulse that was given to you in a problem, but it comes from your saying, I thought this was this way, but it's not. And what is it? It suddenly becomes this real search and a real impulse. And I think that's the germ of anyone's process. Now, you can go about it as Myra Kalman says, or as about any of the examples that you gave, but it's that moment of saying, of the uncertainty I think is necessary, and then this search. And it could be large or small.
I think that, for me, when I was a kid, the one thing I wanted to be able to do when I grew up was have an idea. I saw all these great things happening in Mad Magazine and comic books and Life magazine, drawings and the like, illustrations. And they all seemed to be able to communicate something through what I considered an idea. And when I got old enough to be in a position where I worked with ideas, somebody told me there was a process by which you can make these things happen. But it was just a very simple skeletal process, and the rest of it was, it will come. And so the skeletal process was, think of something like a metaphor or an analogy. And once you think of that, you say, well, this could be to that, which this could be to this, and that just starts the juices going. And then if you don't have that juice, you got nothing. And I don't think I could be taught to have the juice part. I had the glass.
But having the juice part, I think, is, I'm assuming that you mean that the juice is the idea.
Well, the juice is what makes the idea into a bigger idea.
But so if we're talking about ideas and we're talking about process, I think personally we're talking about different things, because an idea is a spark of creativity. The process is the actual tactics, I think, that you undertake to bring that spark to life.
Right, but one is dependent on the other.
I don't know if I agree with that.
For me, I think my understanding of the process tends to encompass idea, form, finalizing, in all of its stages, and again, I think a lot of times design in particular tends to be idea-driven, but it's not the only way. You know, I think, if I could say one thing about what you were talking about, I think that taking ownership of the work from an individual's standpoint is major, and then from there you can have all these revelations, and your assumptions can be sort of questioned, right? But I think one's ownership of their task, saying, I'm making this thing and I'm responsible for it, is really fundamental. And I think that in, I don't know what you'd want to call it, applied, you know, commercial art, applied arts, I think that sometimes there's this thing that happens where you're not really engaged in the creative process for yourself, that you're the maker, that you're just sort of implementing other people's ideas. And so, you know, I think to what you were saying, I think this ownership of the process and of the making is really fundamental. To this aspect of the idea, I think that idea-based work ends up, especially today, but even it's not necessarily generational, but it ends up being one way of working, which was a huge revelation for me, because I assume the same things about design, that the idea comes first and then the making comes from it, and that's not a universal standard, even though we think
So do you think that there's a process for coming up with ideas, or do you think it's about showing up and doing the work every day, and then that muse or inspiration coming based on your education and your surroundings and your work ethic?
I think it depends on who you ask.
And I think it's also very abstract. It's, you know, and it's semantics. When we talk about process, there's somebody has an idea for me. When we talk about process, it really it comes down to, you can learn certain rules of the road that you can follow or not follow. And that is in any walk of life. In art, it's supposed to be less of a deal, but when you're teaching it, you need some structure so that there's something to follow and something to rebel against. When you're talking about ideas, you're talking about they come from different places, and they're in I love these light bulbs, these naked light bulbs, because they have ideas in them. You know, and then you throw it into whatever theory or process you may have ingested through your entire life, and then it pops out again. I think what we try to do is define these things in our respective books. For me, mine is not about there is or is not a process. Mine is there's an object, and I'm trying to describe what the object is made out of and why it's special.
So that brings up a kind of attentiveness to the here and now, and not being in your head about a pre-existing theory, right? Which is, I think, you know, when I talked about the impulse, that the true impulse, not the one that you're given, you know, do this, the brief, or whatever the official intention is at the start, but through this kind of, you know, I would say something gets unsettled. There is almost you know, something. There's a negative space and there's a negative pressure that exists for something that maybe it's the brief that gets undone, you know, and you rewrite it. You find that ownership through this, your own impulse. But what it does is it makes you suddenly very present, you know, with what's in front of you, which is the object you're talking about. And I do think that's a form of improvisation.
Yeah,
you know, it's a longer, it's not improvisation, you know, like stand-up. You know, it exists
like
over,
jazz.
but it happens over a greater time. And the way I do it in my teaching, because I run the first-year curriculum for many years, is one example is to give a very, very difficult material, so that
Physical material.
Yes. So the students were looking at microscopic slides through the microscope, and were asked to build the structure. But by giving a difficult material, it doesn't behave. So whatever you thought you were going to do, whatever you came into RISD liking, whatever styles or whatever it is, it doesn't necessarily perform in the way that you want it to. And so something else has to happen, and you have to pay attention to what's in front of you, you know, which is what you're saying too.
Yeah.
You know, it also reminds me of what was being done with standard manuals in the 50s, 60s, when they first became popular. It was, you're going to have to follow the rules. Paul Rand used to do this. He had a set of rules, and anybody who worked with him in the IBM lab had to come in and show him something that he could relate to. That didn't necessarily mean that he rejected anything that wasn't his kind of concept, but for the most part it had to be within those rules. And that's where I guess I became kind of anti-process, because process meant following the leader. And I know that's a very rigid way of looking at it, and not very enlightened, but I was born in that generation.
I think that's what I call methodology. And I agree with that. Like, yes.
Your book is titled The Storm of Creativity, and
great title.
You write that the book describes the creative process, actually many processes that comprise a larger process, and you compare the creative process to a storm. Why?
Well, can I talk about brainstorming now? Or
Sure.
So the first thing is that I do not mean brainstorming when I use the word storm, but the meteorological storm, weather. And brainstorm was coined by Alex Fackney Osborne after World War II, and he meant it as a military maneuver, like a barrage of ideas thrown at something. You know, so that kind of brainstorming, which I actually see as being, you throw a lot of preconceptions at something and you have to deal with everybody else's preconceptions. And I see it more as a kind of disturbance. And that something, the negative space that comes from that disturbance, that pressure, starts this process. And it's cyclical, as we all know. There's this reiterative process within creativity, but it also happens at many scales, as do the weather storms. You know, it could be something, a kind of process that peters out very quickly, or it's something that could be very destructive or very life-giving. It could be picked up by, it's contagious too. You know, one storm can create another storm. So there's very unclear boundaries, which is something that I notice a lot. I have some personal stories about this, but how it's very hard to draw a circle around the authorship or one person. Like, where does it begin and end? It's contagious. So there is a kind of arc to it. And when I didn't realize I write about chaos in my book, but someone just gave me the great book by Glick on chaos theory from, you know, a couple of decades ago, and it really does relate. I mean, that there's, you know, chaos is something that cannot be, it's not a linear thing. It's not something that can be solved, but it has patterns within it. So that, I think, is true as well with both. It is true with any kind of state change, like from liquid water to vapor, or from liquid to solid or ice. Those thresholds of transformation, which exist in the creativity as well, are very chaotic, very volatile, but very productive and powerful things that fuel the whole thing, the whole process.
You just described a German art movement called the Sturm.
The Sturm?
The storm.
Yes.
And it's the first time I realized from what you were saying why they called it the Sturm. I just learned something.
Well, I just learned something too.
So I think we all did.
Thank you.
I think we all did. Kyna, you say that like a storm, creativity is bigger than you. It begins before you know it. It is beyond your complete control. In each cycle of the creative process, it involves emptying your mind. And this series of sentences were among my favorite in the book, because each one sort of stopped me, even though it's part of a larger sort of idea. Each one was intriguing in and of itself. Creativity is bigger than you. It begins before you know it. It is beyond your complete control. And I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit about each part of this, in that, how is creativity bigger than a person?
Well, there's many, many examples. I mean, that comes from I mean, I think there are probably so many examples of artists saying it wasn't me, right? I mean, that you feel as though you're a kind of vehicle or you're delivering something. And that's, I think that sense is describing what I'm trying to say in also as an outside observer, how a process is contagious and how it's, I think everything is connected. I think, as Steve Jobs said, that creativity you could define as connecting things, and so that fact alone is saying that you can't, isolate out yourself or your work as being something that is, autonomous.
So if it's beyond your complete control, how does process figure into that?
That's a good example of, that the material is not you. It's something else. It's something other than you, and you have a conversation with it. It fails. There's accidents. There's an example of where my father actually was the designer for Wallace K. Harrison, and a splash of paint on a rendering of the Opera House was the very beginning of the chandeliers. Just before this was going to be presented to Rockefeller. So he had to quickly do something with that. And we all know that accidents, this is true in science, it's true that accidents are part of that misbehaving of the material. I mean, Grotowski, the great theater director, talked about actors, their bodies was their material. If you misalign, what do? You go with it. So that's, again, it's bigger than you. All of the stuff that's part of it is a player as well.
So can you talk a little bit about how to empty the mind and why that's important?
Right. Well, I think that's the real beginning. I speak about like this kind of negative pressure at the outset, but it's cyclical. So you might even take a break. You might sleep on it. You might get a coffee break. You might put the work down entirely and somebody else picks it up. So those pauses, you have to repeat your question, but it comes out of those pauses.
Well, how would one go about attempting to empty the mind? I think it sounds very zen.
Well, yeah, but the most common way of describing it is just saying asking questions. But I think it comes from asking questions so much so that you say, wow, I thought this was true and it's actually not true.
I think there's a way of emptying the mind that it just occurs. I'll write something and I'll think this is the most brilliant thing not that has been done, but that I've done today. And I'll put it aside, get very excited about coming back to it the next day and rip it all apart. And I'm sure everybody does that. Whether it's design, whether it's writing, whether it's choreography, you get this sense that you become too invested in something. If you can divest yourself, you're emptying your brain. I think the one part of the emptying your brain that I'm concerned with is you can empty everything, and then you got nothing, and you got to have something to start with. And I think what you were talking about is that we take from all different sources, whether we're ripping them off for a moment or ripping them off for a long term, or just being influenced by different things that are popping in and out. That to me is process, and that to me is you're pushing things through the brain. It's kind of like it goes in here and it comes out there, and what's left is what you're going to do as your final product, and whether it works or not is another story.
Well, David Eagleman, the neuroscientist, says you have lightning storms within your brain. He actually uses the term lightning storms.
Well, you can see them.
Yes, exactly.
So is that the neural pathways?
Electrical synapses? I'm not a neuroscientist, but yeah.
Myra Kalman states in one of the back cover blurbs of your book, Kyna, that thank God Kyna has written a book, a how not to book. Yeah. So can you help explain what that means? What are you teaching us not to do? Well,
I am anti-methodology. I think in a firm it works well. Like if you're trying to form a consensus as a group, there is certainly some kind of common language, right? And that's true even for surgeons. Like there's an example in the book of neuroscientist doing this long procedure for many, many hours and wearing an apparatus that doesn't allow you to speak, so you have to use your hands to communicate. And they have he says it's a Southern Californian neuroscientist sign language. So, so there are places for that. But I think in school, what I try to do is anti-methodology. I even say it's a-foundational. I want the students to feel that they're reaching for the ground, but then they find it's not there, but then they find out how to deal with that. So those are, that's my philosophy in terms of school.
Would you have students draw from plaster casts if you were born in the 19th century?
With pins that are in the plaster cast so that you can measure them?
Yes.
Probably not.
Why?
But then Paolo Uccello did that and invented a whole new form of perspective. So.
Right. I think that you can follow a methodology and get so sick of it, or realize, as you say, it's wrong, that you've done it and now you're out of it. It's kind of like Philip Guston, the painter, who did such minimalist work, and then all of a sudden he started doing these strange cartoons. He just got sick of what he did.
Yeah.
Peter, in your book, you ask all of the designers that you interviewed to do an exercise with dots, which I actually think articulates a lot of what Kyna is saying about anti-methodology or anti-process. So can you talk a little bit about what you asked them to do and what you learned from seeing the results?
Well, I think the first thing I learned was that...
Well, can you tell people what you did, what you asked people to do?
Okay,
this way
then I'll tell you the first
get a
thing.
sense, yes.
So this, to take a step back, a friend and colleague of mine, this guy Junmo Kang, I was interviewing him, and he drew for me a diagram that Michael Ian Kay had drawn for him when he was a student. And it started with, I'll try to do this backwards so you guys can see it, point A to point B, the beginning and the end. And then from the point A, he drew a circle, or a spiral, thank you. That went like that, and eventually hit B, saying, well, the process is long and it's winding and you don't really know how you got there. But then there's a second part to this diagram, which then draws a line backwards to A that says that each point of intersection are the steps you can articulate to a client, right? Or articulate to yourself, that in hindsight, the process totally makes sense, right? That was inevitable, that it was the way it had to be. But the actual act of getting there, according to this diagram, was much more meandering and nonlinear, right? So then I gave each interviewee from the book a piece of paper with 2 dots on it, and I said, how do you visualize your process? How do you visualize how you get from the beginning to the end? And I mean, what was so interesting was that some people, you'll see in the book, and I only included maybe a dozen of them, Myra Kalman draws this monster. It's like very her. The thing I realized is that Ivan Chermayev is a total genius, but watching him think on the spot, these pieces of paper had 3 hole punch along the top, and he drew an arrow from point A to the dot in the paper because it was closer, right? And you have to see it, but it was the quickest way to another point. But the thing that was more interesting is that it opened up a whole other conversation, which was the maker's job within the project or rather the permission one has to redefine where they start a project, where they can also redefine where the project is supposed to end. And that seemed like such an interesting premise to me, right? Especially coming out of a design practice where usually you have this, back and forth, and like Michael says in his interview, you have certain agreed upon terms in which you're going to make work. And then you get into it and you say, I don't really want to start here. Let's start further back. Or even though I think we're going to end here, let's not do that and end somewhere else. That, being able to move those points was as important as the visualization of how you got there. And I mean, the, I mean, what was so interesting was that some people, you'll see in the book, and I only included maybe a dozen of them, Myra Kalman draws this monster. It's like very her. The thing I realized is that Ivan Chermayev is a total genius, but watching him think on the spot, these pieces of paper had 3 hole punch along the top, and he drew an arrow from point A to the dot in the paper because it was closer, right? And you have to see it, but it was the quickest way to another point. So it's a really fun activity, actually, if anybody wants to do it themselves.
I think my favorite drawing was by Emily Oberman. I believe her drawing was taking the 2 dots and turning them into eyes. And I thought that was Karen Goldberg.
Yeah,
Karen Goldberg, yes. Yeah. So the process of a process is really just looking and observing, which I really
so much about what she...
It's playing.
It's playing.
Right.
Well, Steve, it's interesting that you should say that, because in the improvisation chapter of your book, you state great design involves large doses of improvisational energy. And Kyna, you were saying that as well, both before and after deciding on a specific visual direction. Only the most rigid systems are ever really locked in stone. Good design is, after all, about exercising creative license. The power to play and discover is central to design practice of all kinds, and improvisation is key to what Paul Rand heralded as the play principle. Can you talk a little bit more about what the play principle is and how designers can use that to impact their work?
Well, the play principle is very simple. You just don't come to what you're doing with a preconceived notion.
So it's sort of like unlearning.
And it's kind of like unlearning, and you do it. However, in reality, you do come with preconceived notions, because you have your approach, you have your vocabulary. You're not going to change your language overnight. So it's what Paul said, really, he probably practiced, but not 100%. And, you know, I tend to quote him often on the play principle in a number of books I've done, because it sounds good. And, you know, it's the kind of thing that when we're talking about teaching students, you throw that at them. And you say, it's time to play. You know, that's what you got into art for, even commercial art. It was not to be an accountant, not to follow the numbers in a plumbing manual, but to play. And at a certain point, you realize that you have to rein in some of that play. And that's called refinement. And that's where Paul went to the next level. You know, logos could be drawn out in 22 seconds, but it took 22 days to refine something. And so the play principle is that way of getting into something. And whether you maintain the play for 1 hour or 1 day or 1 month, that is up to you. That perhaps is process.
Do you think that, and this will be my last question, and then I'd like to open up questions to the audience. Do you think that style is codified process? Style
is more like a coat and a shirt and a tie. I think if somebody relies on style, then it's part of their process. If somebody comes to a style through play, then it's part of the natural occurrence. But, you know, this differs for everybody. It's like Seymour Quast, who was here last night, still working at 84, with a Kickstarter, by the way, on line that we all want to see him win. He has 10 different styles, and there are 10 different voices that he has, or 10 different idioms that he uses. I don't think it's part of his process. I think it's part of his personality. And I think a process is something different from a personality. I'm jumping around in terms of what the definition of process is. I'm not being very helpful to the audience, because I'm not sure. You know, I think a process tends to be routine. If you reduce it to one word, it's routine. And
you agree with that, Keith?
Follow a routine.
Well, you know, I realize that I'm probably spending more of my time teaching and speaking about this whole thing from that point of view, right? So it's not an atelier or an existing great designer and the people that are working with him, and that there's something that's been proven and a language that's been developed that needs refinement more than throwing it out. So, but I think style to me is a form of knowledge. You know, it's connoisseurship, which is knowing. And if I can imagine if and that, you know, it can be refined, it can evolve. But I think, you know, for a student to come in with, this is my style, would be a problem. You know, because it's sort of all knowing unlearning is about questioning what you think you know, right? So you have to get rid of it. If you're 19 years old and you come in with the whole thing figured out, there's really no point in being there at school. It's there, you come to school to change your mind, right? So it's not, style doesn't play, and style is spoken about most in history class, because it is a body of knowledge, right? So
Marker.
Yeah.
I love the idea that the next school should be called the Unlearning University. Because that's the way you're describing learning, is unlearning and then finding something else. So
well, I think one of the interesting things about learning something new is the idea of something surprising you.
Exactly.
Which is something that concerns me a little bit in just the simple act of reading the newspaper. When we read the newspaper online, we're not really going through the paper discovering surprises. We tend to look for the things we want to read. And I worry now that the way we consume knowledge is curtailed by the lack of being available to something new.
But we can find surprise in that vertical. I mean, if you look hard enough, if you're not just stopped, you'll find that crazy thing. There's something online now about, I can't remember anything, of disease, spores, boils. Look on the New York Times site. Some terrible disease that got cured.
Oh, the Zika disease?
Not the Zika disease. This was an old disease.
Oh.
Not yellow fever, but
smallpox.
Smallpox.
I saw that. It's
Whoa,
on the cover.
I was just about to take off my jacket and look
and
at the
about whether
scar.
or not we should keep the disease for educational purposes.
Right, for posterity.
Right, or should we be destroying
But, that was
the
a
only
huge
remnant?
surprise
Yeah.
to see this thing that I probably wouldn't have gotten flipping through the paper, because I go into the arts section and see who's doing what.
So it was just on the home, because it was on the homepage.
So surprises come to us different ways now.
Well, in having read all three books that we're talking about today, they come to, not surprisingly, the idea of process and learning and surprise and play and chaos in very different ways. But if you were to do a Venn diagram, the center of the three would be true inspiration. You come away really learning different ways that people think, why they do the things that they do, how they create, and you come away really learning something about how we create. So I'd love to open up the questions to the audience. I think we have about 10 minutes, is that right? 10 minutes, and then all three authors will do a book signing. So anybody have the first question?
I have a question.
Yes.
So we're all familiar with the term writer's block. And I'm wondering, is there such a thing as designer's block? And if there is what you're describing to kind of acquaint designers with a way around that? Is that with the idea of coming up with a creative process? Or is the point that you're saying you really can't do that and it's very personal, intuitive?
It's a fascinating question, stranger. I think that there are blocks that all of us have for a lot of different activities, and writer's block to me was always you've written the same sentence over and over again. And a lot of people can write very well for a long time with writer's block, because they just keep repeating themselves. And I think designers repeat themselves in the form of style sometimes, or they'll start with an initial cap. I mean, there are all sorts of tropes that you can use to kind of get around this so-called block, but it's trying something very different that's hard. And I had a student once who did fine in one method, and then one day he said, I have to try something else, and it was awful. I mean, it was just pitiful. And I told him, go back to what you know best. And I felt so guilty telling him that. But he hadn't hit the nail on the head. So he was still suffering from his block, and I couldn't teach him not to. Sorry.
It's very interesting. I asked Milton Glaser that question a few weeks ago. Does he suffer from designer's block? And he said that would preclude the process of designing being a negative one, that he finds so much joy in actually discovering the solution that he doesn't feel like it's ever a block. It's just part of the process of working.
Right.
And I loved that.
Or part of the fun of work.
Yeah, exactly. But that the notion of a block in and of itself was bad terminology, because that effort was something he really enjoyed.
But I think we know what you're talking about, though.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah.
And I think it exists everywhere. Like it exists in science. You know, one of my favorite examples is the guy who invented the barcode was working on it at Drexel University for years, and you know, he basically had to come up with something that you can put on any object so it could be quickly identified, right? And couldn't come up with anything, gave up, went to his parents' house in Florida, sat on the beach the first day, stuck his 4 fingers in the sand and drew it towards him. And he went, oh, that's it. Because he had studied Morse code when he was a Boy Scout, so he knew that lines could be coded. They have different lengths, different widths, different spacings. But that, you know, that's something that I think is an example of you're working on something and it's buried deep in the unconscious. This is the value of taking a break too, right? That it can start to percolate up without that willful, like, I want it to happen when, in The Shining where he's writing the same phrase again and again, that kind of willfulness.
Would you
can
call
actually
it a brainstorm?
Well, that
In your sense
in
of
my
brainstorm?
sense of brainstorm, yes, yeah,
A lightning storm.
right.
Elizabeth Gilbert in her TED Talk talks about how you have to still show up every single day, even when you feel like you have nothing to write or nothing to contribute that day, because you never know when it is going to hit you. And I love the notion of just showing up to do the work.
Yeah.
I show up all the time, and 80% of what I do is shit. But I put it out, and
Keep going.
it's there.
With that many books published, I don't think that the publishers think that it's not up to par. Other questions? Yes.
I just want to say, Stephen, great to hear from all of you, and I'm definitely buying at least that book. The other probably for Kindle. But Stephen, it's been such an honor to meet you in person. You responded to an email of mine, read a paper of mine when I was back in design school, way back in the day, 13 years ago. And I so appreciate your generosity now. And to witness your thought process has been amazing to me, and I think possibly to others. You go from thing to thing, and it's been amazing to witness. I wish I had a voice recording. So thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
1 or 2 more questions? Yes.
You had said that design is either good or bad, and I'm curious to know if you think everyone recognizes good when they see it, or do you have to have a design-oriented mind to see it?
It's a really good question, because everybody has that thing called subjectivity. I was going to say taste, but taste is so nebulous. No, not everybody realizes. You know, as an art director, I've spent many days getting things brought into me that I thought was crap, and I'd say so, in a constructive way, like, this is crap, do it again. But 5 out of 10 times I'd get an argument, and out of those 5 out of 10, I think 3 were right. If that, I'm looking at it through my sense of what is good or bad. I mean, right now I'm working on a book with Greg D'Onofrio and Patricia Bellin called The Moderns, and it's all about mid-century modern designers who haven't really gotten that much exposure. And the impetus for the book was geometry. And for most of my design life, I hated geometry. Paul Rand used to say, what could be better than geometry? when somebody was threatening to cancel the ABC logo or have somebody else do it. It's just geometry. What could be worse? Or what could improve upon it? And I just thought the use of geometry was cold and impersonal, and now I'm totally absorbed in it. So things change, and whether it's an intellectual rationale, which will probably come out in the introduction, or just an emotional one, which is why the real reason I feel I've changed. Those perspectives do change. So good and bad is a subjective term, and when somebody says it's really bad, they're coming at it with a whole wealth of other rationale and biases, I think.
It's interesting, though, how what is considered good or bad changes over time, and how the idea of something being controversial and people having polarizing opinions eventually arriving at a point of view that we all, as a culture, accept, whether it's good or whether it's bad. And it's a matter of time before that happens.
And it also skips generations.
Yeah.
I think the good and bad idea has something to do with practice as well, depending on what you're engaging in. I would guess that for architecture, and you could speak to this more specifically, because it's more permanent and there's more longevity to architecture, it requires a greater discourse, and you need lots of people to be able to talk about and evaluate these things. I think with graphic design, it's much more nebulous, because some design is only meant to last for like a week, and some is meant to last for 6 months, and some is, that the application or the working with graphic design, the time frame varies so much. And its functionality is also very hard to measure. I think with other practices, there are greater constraints, right? A chair has to do something very definitive. Graphic design is more malleable.
Well, also it's a code, and if you don't buy into the code, I was reviewing a student's thesis work. She's not here, is she? And she had a lot of blurry images, and these were like title spreads for something. And my critique was the blurriness and the crop just don't make any sense, and it takes away because I start thinking about it too much and I lose the content of what she's offering. And there was somebody else at the review table who studies trends, and she said, you may be right, but millennials love this.
Right.
So I was wrong.
You weren't the intended audience.
Exactly.
Right.
Did you have a follow-up question?
Yeah, when you were just saying that it changes over time and something that was bad before is now good, do you have any idea what influences that?
I think it's a matter of getting used to something. Most people have issues with change. Not everybody, but most people find change to be off-putting. We like being able to recognize the things that are familiar in our lives. And when we change those, when designers or brand consultants change those things, people get very insecure about what is stable in their lives. And the lizard brain, the reptilian brain, all of the alarm bells go off about not being secure and not being able to count on certain things. Then once we get accustomed to that change, we tend to accept it. And the very things that once frightened us are things that now comfort us. And if you look at, historically, some of the big identity logo changes over time, what people really weren't upset about was a change of the specific letter forms, because those letter forms maybe weren't all that wonderful to begin with. What they were more upset about was the thing that they were so familiar with suddenly being unfamiliar.
But I think you're absolutely right. I think, the friendly trade character gave way to the mark. And so people lost their grounding of what a product was that they were getting in their homes. But I also think things change because somebody tells us they change. You know, art history, architecture history is about very smart people writing their opinions. And their opinions, if they're convincing, change our opinions. Right. Because we don't know as much, or we want to be told. So anything that is taste-based is going to be fungible if you find somebody who is a really good advocate for that thing, or you know, a critic of that thing.
So I find it, from my point of view with architecture, a difficult question, the good and the bad question, because I think it's always within the work itself has its own criteria for good and bad. Maybe because it's complex and it involves so many things, and it's not only like the building, you know, it's the context of the building is part of the forming of the criteria of whether it's good or bad. And that can also change. Like the art historians would identify the Renaissance as being so certain about the center, but actually, you know, Robin Evans was a historian who went back and did the drawings that Bernini did, and saw that the compass points jumped around. So there was no certitude about the center at all. It was a search for it, but it's been identified that way. So then you saw that was really the question that he was struggling with, was where is the center? It wasn't about it is here. Right. And then Stephen Jay Gould talked about, I think the example he gave in class, but so it's a long memory, was that DNA was not recognized until the music box was created. That culture couldn't accept coding until, so it, like something had to move within our day to recognize, a discovery that was made previously. So, it could be overlooked as, irrelevant, or we couldn't know how to process it. It wasn't bad. Yeah. But then it suddenly became vital and necessary because we shifted to recognize it.
I love the idea of the folly.
What do you mean?
In architecture and other things, but mostly in architecture. Somebody builds something somewhere that's out of context, and you just stumble upon it, and it could be as ugly as sin, but because it's out of context, it's not next to another building that's beautiful, it's not detracting from anything, that it becomes special. It doesn't have to be good or bad or beautiful or ugly. It's just its own entity.
So it's like the Easter egg on a website.
Yes.
One last question. Oh, I'm sorry, Peter, were you going to say something?
I was just going to add one thing to what you were saying, and then we can do one last question. Then
okay.
We'll be done. I think this idea of ownership over the work is really important as it goes back to the process, and even starting from where our conversation started, the importance of looking at the process. I think that in everything we engage with, at the end of the day, we make work that the culture and the public owns, right? Which is why a logo, love it or hate it, when it gets changed, there's oftentimes such an uproar because someone felt ownership over that.
Yeah.
When they engage with, right? And because at the end of the day, we as makers of things have very little control over other people's ownership of things, I think that it makes the point that it's critical to, in order to take satisfaction out of the work you make, that you engage in the process in a way that's gratifying. That the act of making is the only thing that's yours. The thing that you make goes out into the world. That's not an original idea, but I think it's really relevant when talking about the need of looking at the process, and as makers of things, turning our attention to it and feeling the gratification from the making itself, because after we're done, who knows? Who knows how it'll be.
Do you feel the gratification if you make it in the same way that many other people make it, or do you feel more gratification if you've made it the way only you can make it?
I think that depends on the criteria that you go into the project with. If originality for yourself, I made something that's original to me, or I made something original because no one's ever seen it before, that I think the role of defining what you intend to do.
How high are you setting the bar?
Yeah, exactly.
So intention is part of the process.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I think so.
Well, I think rather than have time for one last question, I know people want their book signed, so I'd like to thank Peter Ahlberg and Kyna Leski and Stephen Heller for this wonderful conversation, and all the folks at the Strand, and of course Steve Croder for making this happen.
Yes.
For Designers and Books. Thank you so much, everybody.
That's the gray-haired stranger.